Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Today, I am going to go over the results of the 2022 midterm elections. Some very exciting stuff, very unexpected stuff that happened on Tuesday. First, we're going to go look at the Senate. Now, going in, the Senate was always the most exciting set of races because they were simply the most unpredictable. There were five states that would have determined which way this was going and who would control the Senate after these midterm elections. And those five were Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and New Hampshire. Now, as of recording this, we don't know the final outcome in two of those races. One being Georgia, because it is going to a runoff election on December 6th. And I'll get into why that is. And the other is Nevada, because they're still counting ballots that were mailed in. And we should have a resolution in Nevada soon, but we have a pretty good idea of where it's going. So to recap, going into this election, it was a 50-50 Senate. Now, there's 100 senators, so to get a majority when it's 50-50, it's really determined by who's president. And the reason for that is because the vice president of the United States is the president of the Senate, and therefore is the tie-breaking vote. So in this case, you have 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, or 50 senators who caucus with Democrats. A couple of them are technically independents, and 50 Republicans. But the reason why it is a Democratic Senate is because the vice president is currently Kamala Harris, and she's a Democrat. So she can break a tie vote anytime that she's needed for that. And she's actually made the most tie-breaking votes in US history for any vice president. She set a record for that. So going into this election, it was the smallest lift possible for Republicans to win the Senate. They only needed to net one seat, which means in the five states that I mentioned, they had to win two of them. And the reason for that is Republicans held Pennsylvania going into the midterms. Senator Pat Toomey, a Republican, was retiring. So it was an open race between Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and celebrity TV doctor Mehmet Oz. And that was always a very competitive race. But the others all had Democratic incumbents. We had New Hampshire with Senator Maggie Hassan. We had Georgia with Senator Raphael Warnock. We had Nevada with Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, and Arizona with Senator Mark Kelly. And all of them were in very competitive races. Polling showed them to be dead heats. In some cases, some of them were seen as underdogs, specifically in Nevada. And in others, they were leading, such as Arizona and New Hampshire, but just by a hair, where their lead was very, very fragile. And it wouldn't have been surprising if the race had gone either way. Now, looking back historically at midterms, especially first year midterms for an incumbent president, it typically favors the party that is out of power or the party that doesn't have the presidency. We look back at the last time there was an incumbent president in 2018, had a first year midterm. President Trump was in office then. And at that point, Republicans lost 41 seats in the House, but they actually gained two in the Senate because they had a favorable map. Before that, in 2010, when President Obama was in office, Republicans actually gained 63 seats in the House and 6 seats in the Senate. And that was largely due to the fact that in 2008, Democrats won 21 seats, and in 2006, they won 31 seats, and they won in a lot of House districts that today they would not be competitive in, that they really had no business winning because 2006 and 2008 were both wave elections. And when the tide recedes, a lot of those seats were very, very easy pickups for Republicans. Going back in other examples, when President Bill Clinton was in office, in 1994, Republicans picked up 54 seats in the House and 8 seats in the Senate, and they flipped the House that year. Even going back to President Reagan in 1982, Democrats won 26 seats in the House and 1 in the Senate. So it's typical for a president's party to do quite poorly their first midterm. There are exceptions, notably 2002, where when President George W. Bush was in office, Republicans actually won 8 seats in the House and picked up 2 in the Senate. But that was more of an anomaly because in 2002, Bush went into that midterm with a net quite positive approval ratings. I believe his approval ratings were somewhere in the low to mid 60s. Whereas this year going in, President Biden's approval ratings were in the mid 40s, which was in line with where President Trump was, President Obama, and President Clinton, and President Reagan. So using the historical data on this, it was a very, very valid assumption. Republicans are probably going to win the House very easily and have a very good chance of picking up the Senate. But that didn't happen. There wasn't a red wave, so to speak. If anything, it was a red ripple. And Democrats greatly performed outside of what their expectations were, or greatly overperformed expectations, I should say, with the exception of 2 states, New York and Florida. And we'll get to those too. But I want to start with the Senate because this is a very important contest, because this will determine if over the next 2 years, if there is a Supreme Court vacancy, whether or not it would get filled. And I want you to recall in 2016, when that exact scenario happened, when Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia suddenly passed away and there was an open Supreme Court seat, and President Obama at the time nominated Merrick Garland. And he did not only not get a vote, he didn't even get a hearing. He wasn't even considered. That his nomination was dead on arrival in the Senate. And the reason for that, the real reason for that, is simply because Republicans controlled the Senate. Now, there is some political posturing over it, saying, well, it's an election year. We should have the American people decide who the next president that fills the Supreme Court seat should be. But that was never genuine. That was never a serious argument, because in 2020, the same exact thing happened, only this time weeks before an election. If you recall, in 2020, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and Republicans at the time had the Senate and they had the presidency, and they moved to fill that vacancy with Amy Coney Barrett just days before the election, after tens of thousands of people had already voted and were voting. They didn't have the whole idea of let's let the people decide. They had the power and they did what they did with it. They did what they could with it. And that's a fundamental principle of political power. You do what you have with it. When you have it, you leverage it to the best of your advantage. And Mitch McConnell understood that. So by that fact pattern, had Republicans won the Senate, and if there were any Supreme Court vacancies over the next 2 years, there is not a snowball's chance in hell that they would ever consider appointing a replacement on the Supreme Court. But the fact that Democrats are going to win the Senate changes that. And I'll tell you how they did. First of all, let's start with Pennsylvania. This is a race that I was quite frankly surprised at the results. John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, he had led in the polls for most of the entire campaign, all summer into the fall, but things started getting closer in the end. There was tens of millions of dollars invested in just pummeling him with negative ads on the air in Pennsylvania, mostly attacking him for issues like crime and other basic economic issues that were seen as real headwinds for Democrats going into this election cycle. And on top of that, there was another major unexpected complication in this race. And that was just a couple days before the primary election, where John Fetterman ended up winning every single county in his respective primary. He suffered a stroke and was hospitalized for quite some time, taken off the campaign trail, and it wasn't ever immediately clear how serious that was. His campaign never released his medical records, despite being hounded by the Oz campaign and the media to do so. But they did release a doctor's note saying that Lieutenant Governor Fetterman is perfectly fit to serve. But that didn't really answer a whole lot of questions in terms of how serious was his actual condition. And we saw the effects of that on a debate on October 25th. It was the only debate that Dr. Oz and Lieutenant Governor Fetterman had. And he did not perform well. Fetterman did not perform well. The signs of his strokes were very apparent. And at that point, I remember watching it thinking, I think he lost this. I went in expecting him to lose, fully prepared for that. The race had already been tightening to a dead heat before that, and I genuinely thought that this was the thing that would push it over. But there was something quite spectacular that happened that I personally misread, and I think a lot of political pundits misread as well. And I think that is the respect that voters have for folks who show up. What I mean by that is Fetterman got knocked down, and a lot of people, almost everyone, knows someone, has a loved one who has suffered from a medical condition beyond their control. Maybe they suffer from one themselves. Everyone in life has had setbacks. And the fact that he showed up and debated anyways, and while he struggled through some of his answers, while he had auditory issues and had to use closed captioning to get through it, it showed a certain level of respect for the voters that I think really resonated among people in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And not only that, the way he ran his campaign too, he went outside of the Democratic strongholds. If you notice this map, you'll see where the Democratic strongholds are: Philadelphia, in and around the suburbs there, Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, and up here in Scranton. Now, you could carry the state just by running up the numbers there, in theory. And there have been candidates both winning and losing in the past that have done that. But Fetterman did something different. He went outside of the comfort zones and he campaigned in these ruby red counties. Like, look at this, like Somerset County, 74 to 23, almost a 50-point split between Oz and Fetterman. You could go on any of these, it's almost 70-30, 70-20 something. And while those are all blowouts, the fact is Oz actually underperformed, just slightly underperformed, how Trump did in all of those counties, both in 2016 when Trump won Pennsylvania and in 2020 when he lost Pennsylvania. And why that matters is at the margins, that makes all the difference. And you'll also notice in Senator Warnock's campaign, he campaigned outside of the Atlanta metro area and he ran up the score too. And Fetterman never went to those parts of the state with the intention of or expectation of flipping any of those counties. It was all to shave the margin off here and there, show that he's looking for votes everywhere and will talk to anyone and listen to anyone. And that matters too. That's the type of work ethic in a campaign that will win or lose at the margins in very competitive states. Now, there was also a big factor in this race, or in the election in Pennsylvania in general, that I think made a very, very significant difference, and in many ways dragged Dr. Oz down. And that was the governor's race. Now, pay attention to the margin here. See that Fetterman is winning by just over 4 points, 4.3 percentage points, or about 230,000 votes. Let's go over to the governor's races here. Go to Pennsylvania. Look at that. From Attorney General Josh Shapiro and State Senator Doug Mastriano. That is a over 14-point margin. Shapiro is just crushing Mastriano. Now, Mastriano, like Dr. Mehmet Oz, was also a Trump-endorsed candidate for governor. But Mastriano was very far to the right of many conventional candidates. And his campaign was a lot less funded than Oz's was by a long shot. But Mastriano was just a complete albatross on the entire Pennsylvania Republican ticket. He lost by such a large margin. I actually did a county by county analysis. I looked at every county in Pennsylvania. Oz outperformed him in every single county. And the delta between Mastriano and Oz is about 10 points, which is astounding. And while Oz lagged in the polls for the vast majority of the campaign, and that had a lot to do with his negatives being driven up by a very, very brutal primary where he just narrowly edged out David McCormick. While he started as an underdog there, at least if you believe the polls are accurate, I don't think there's anyone that could have really overcome a 14-point deficit from the top of the ticket. That is just an astounding margin. But back to the Senate. That's Pennsylvania, and that was a Democratic pickup. So 50-50, Democrats picked up one. But we're not quite out of the woods yet here, because there are still 2 states that are left to be determined. There is Georgia, which is going to a runoff, and there is Nevada, which has yet to be called. And you'll notice here, Adam Laxalt is 821 votes ahead of Catherine Cortez Masto. But what ballots are remaining, where we are getting these votes from, are counties that are favorable to Cortez Masto, specifically Clark County here, which is Las Vegas, which is slightly in favor of Cortez Masto. Clark County, if you're familiar with it, it's Vegas and then the outer Vegas suburbs and exurbs. So it's a little bit redder than most urban counties. But a lot of the votes that she is getting are from mail ballots, and mail ballots tend to skew Democrats. So do early voting ballots. So while she's winning the county by about 7 points, these outstanding ballots are going to be more favorable to her than just by a 7-point margin. She's also doing quite well in Washoe County, where Reno is. And the rest of the state is pretty ruby red. We probably won't have an official call on Nevada until maybe next week. But at this point, I would much rather be Catherine Cortez Masto than Adam Laxalt at this point. I believe that she has effectively closed this race. Also, just today, another race that we were watching very closely was Arizona, where incumbent Senator Mark Kelly beat Blake Masters. And this was a very significant win because, one, Arizona is a big swing state. It was one of the states that propelled Joe Biden to the presidency in 2020. It's going to be a very competitive state in 2024. And Kelly was very well funded. He's a very strong candidate. Masters, on the other hand, is a newcomer to politics, a lot younger. He's part of the new right, which is this sort of new way that a faction of the Republican Party has gone over the last few years, and he was heavily funded by Peter Thiel. But he didn't get as much money from McConnell's PAC. And that's actually a frustration among a lot of Republicans, that they don't feel enough was invested in Arizona here. There's also a very competitive governor's race. While there is a resolution for the Senate here, if we look at the governor's race, it is still too close to call. We have Katie Hobbs up by just over 31,000 votes against Kari Lake. And this one is going to come down to the wire. I don't know what is going to happen here just yet. I think this is about as close to a coin toss as you can get, because the night started out with Hobbs with a decent lead and Kelly with an even more decent lead. But as these ballots are coming in and being counted, Lake and Masters closed the gap by quite a bit. And you'll notice in these numbers, because we're looking at the same ballots here as we were in the Senate race, Senator Mark Kelly is outrunning Katie Hobbs by a pretty significant margin. He's up almost 250,000 votes, where she's only just over 30,000. So it remains to be seen what happens there. But that is the Senate. Other thing to note, New Hampshire, we thought this might be a possible flip. It was not that competitive, it turned out. Maggie Hassan easily won re-election, despite Chris Sununu, the governor, winning his re-election in a landslide there. And the reason why New Hampshire was interesting is because they don't have early voting. So Maggie Hassan led in just about every reputable poll that I saw. She was leading in the polls throughout the entirety of the campaign, but the trajectory was getting a little bit closer. The race was narrowing in the final weeks. And why that matters is if you look at any other state that has early voting, like Pennsylvania or Georgia or Arizona or Nevada, if you are a candidate that is up in the polls while people are voting, you're probably netting more votes out of that. But if the race tightens on election day and all of a sudden you're netting a lower share or a smaller share of those votes, you still have a cushion from the votes that you got prior while you were up. That doesn't exist in a state that doesn't have early voting like that. So it wouldn't matter if Maggie Hassan was leading in the polls all year if her opponent closed the gap just prior to election day and then won the E-Day vote by enough margin to flip. That didn't happen, though. And that matters not only for this year's control of the Senate, but also has 2024 implications as well. The last one we're going to look at is Georgia. Now, Georgia is interesting because it is one of two states that has something called a runoff rule or a runoff system. And what that means is to win outright in Georgia, you don't have to just beat your opponent. You have to win over 50%. If you'll notice in the governor's race in Georgia, Brian Kemp actually cleared 50%. He got over 53%. So he was elected outright. He won his election on election night. But Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, neither of them got to the 50% threshold. Warnock came painfully close, just by over half a percentage point. But with what votes are remaining and where they're coming from, it won't be enough to get him over 50%. So he will have to face Herschel Walker again on December 6th. Now that's going to be interesting because, one, based on what we're looking at in Nevada, it does not look like this will be the crucial determinative Senate race like it was almost 2 years ago. If you recall, 2 years ago, the same thing happened. There was 2 Senate seats up at the same time. That happens sometimes. It happened in Oklahoma this year. And back in 2020, both Warnock and John Ossoff, kept their opponents, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, under 50%. So they went to a runoff in early January, and they both won their respective races. So that was a net +2 pickups for Democrats right there, and that actually won them the Senate. The control of the Senate was determined by those 2 races, and that was the most consequential thing of President Biden's presidency. Because think about what would have happened if those races had gone differently. It would have been a 52-48 Republican Senate. Mitch McConnell would have been majority leader, not Chuck Schumer. You would not have had a Supreme Court vacancy filled, likely, or maybe you would have, because it was a Democrat appointee replacing another Democratic appointee to the Supreme Court. You might have been able to shave off Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins or Mitt Romney, who all ended up voting for Ketanji Brown Jackson. But it would have been very difficult to get to that point. And on top of that, some of the big legislative accomplishments that came down to the line would not have passed either. These 2 races were so crucial. Warnock is up again, and going into December 6th, he has a couple of advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages are, one, it's a different electorate, and runoff races tend to be relatively lower turnout than general election races are. And with lower turnout, it's a different electorate, a different composition. Higher turnout is often associated with better for Democrats, but that's not necessarily true. I think 2020 and 2022 in some races actually proved that. What matters is the composition of the electorate. So you have a lot of Republicans and Republican-leaning voters that turned out to vote for Brian Kemp for re-election and the down-ballot congressional races, but didn't necessarily turn out just to vote for Herschel Walker. And now they are going to have to turn out just to vote for Herschel Walker, with the knowledge that it's not going to make a difference in who controls the Senate. So it remains to be seen whether that depresses turnout on the right or depresses turnout on the left. I think there's a case to be made for both. But I would probably favor Senator Warnock going into this race, because one, it's going to be very well funded, and two, Herschel Walker substantially underperformed other Republicans that were on the ballot. He underperformed Brian Kemp by about 5 points. And that was largely having to do with the fact that he has a lot of personal baggage and controversies that are weighing him down. And he was benefited by folks that showed up and voted for Kemp, but also checked his name off on the ballot just because they were there. And he's not going to have the benefit of any other Republicans sharing the ballot with him this time around. So that's going to be interesting. Keep that in mind. Watch Georgia on December 6th, because that's going to determine whether or not Democrats have 50 or 51 seats in the Senate. That's enough of the Senate. Let's go to the governor's race real quick, because these are pretty interesting. So as you'll note here, Republicans actually just flipped one governor's seat so far. That was in Nevada. That's where Joe Lombardo just pretty narrowly eked out a win against Sisolak there. And that's interesting because Lombardo ended up winning but Cortez Masto, the Democrat, also looks like she's going to win. And that's been a pretty consistent theme of the night, where there's been ticket splitting. There's ticket splitting in Georgia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, all across the board, Wisconsin especially. And we're going to look at why that is and where that is. On top of that, Democrats flipped 2 governor seats so far. One is in Massachusetts. This time, you did not have Charlie Baker on the ballot. He was a very popular, very moderate. He's about as moderate of a Republican as you can be. Perfect fit for that state, for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But you had a pretty dyed-in-the-wool, true believer Republican this time, and he just got swamped. I mean, complete shellacking there. The other place you had that is Maryland. Larry Hogan, 2-term governor, he's out. And you had Dan Cox, who engaged in election conspiracy theories and was a very, very far-right candidate. And his opponent was Wes Moore. And keep an eye on him, because Wes Moore is a very, very compelling candidate. He entered a crowded primary for governor where he actually beat a former DNC chair, Tom Perez. He actually, an Obama era cabinet official, he beat 2 Obama cabinet officials in that race, and he came as an underdog in that race and ended up obviously winning by a landslide because his opponent was quite weak, and Maryland is a pretty blue state normally. And if Wes Moore manages Maryland well, he has access to the DC media market. He's a very compelling life story. He's a veteran, and I think he's a force to be reckoned with. I would look to him as a potential 2028 presidential candidate for the Democrats. The races that are yet to be called are Arizona. If Katie Hobbs holds on here, that will be another Democratic pickup. So they would net 2 seats by flipping 3 seats. And the other one yet to be called is Alaska. Dunleavy's likely going to win that. Alaska, though, takes a long time to call because they have ranked choice voting now. So that's not as apparent right away. But the fact that he's over 50% on first ballot means that he's very, very likely, almost certainly going to win that. Interesting results and surprising results among the governors. I want to start with New York. Now, I mentioned in the beginning there were 2 states where there actually was a red wave, and these are 2 states that are pretty much islands in a vast sea of areas where a red wave did not happen. But New York, you'll notice, typically a very solidly blue state. Chuck Schumer in the Senate race won by double digits, 13 points, I believe, there. Notice how this is less than a 6-point race. It's about almost like just over a 5.5-point race so far. They're still counting ballots. Hochul's margin is probably going to go up a little bit. But the down ballot effect this had was pretty devastating and might have single-handedly cost Democrats the House. I'll show you why that is later. But bookmark New York, we'll come back to that. Obviously, we saw Pennsylvania earlier with Josh Shapiro just blowing out Doug Mastriano, just blowing them out of the water there. Shapiro was another person to watch for 2028, along with Wes Moore. I think Shapiro is a potential presidential candidate if he manages Pennsylvania well. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. Now, she was a top tier target of Republicans this year. They really wanted to take her out, and polling showed that this race would be quite close. I expected her to win by maybe single digits, mid-single digits, and she ended up winning by double digits. Not only that, but the down ballot effect there flipped a seat, helped Democrats hold on to a couple very competitive seats, almost won them another seat too that Had they invested a little bit more, and they probably would have flipped, and then it was in the 10th district. And for the first time in 40 years, flipped the legislature in Michigan. And what that means is going into her second term, it's going to be so much more consequential policy-wise than her first term was. And I would also watch out for Gretchen Whitmer in 2028 as well. She's a likely presidential candidate there too. There's some birds behind me. I don't know what that's about. Wisconsin, Tony Evers held on. That I did not expect. I thought that would be a very likely flip, especially because Ron Johnson also held on to his Senate seat. That was a Republican hold by just a point. And that was also a lot closer than we thought. Wisconsin was a lot more blue than we thought this year. That was surprising. Minnesota as well. Tim Walz held on by a comfortable margin. Colorado, this one was surprising. Wasn't surprising that Jared Polis was reelected. We expected that. The surprising thing was the margin. By almost 18 points so far, and they're still counting ballots. Now, Colorado is traditionally a purple state, a swing state. It was a red state up until 2008 when Obama won it for the first time. It was hotly contested in 2012, 2016, a little bit less so in 2020. It wasn't as competitive there. Biden won it by 13.5 points. But Colorado's been drifting blue over the years. It's sort of the opposite of Florida. And Jared Polis, another guy to watch for 2028. I think he would make a very compelling presidential candidate. He's a very popular governor there. And his coattails down ballot was also very significant. It won Democrats some very competitive seats and almost flipped Colorado's 3rd district, which we'll get to later as well. And then we're going to look at the notable, well, before that, Oregon. This was seen as a competitive race, but Kotek won this. Republicans were targeting this state to flip. They were not successful there. Now I want to get to states where Republicans did a lot better than expected or vastly overperformed. Obviously, New Hampshire, Democrats held on to the Senate there, but Chris Sununu won in a landslide. New Hampshire is interesting because they actually have an election every 2 years, whereas every other state is every 4 years, like, normal states. New Hampshire needs to be the oddball out, and they want their governor to constantly be walking on eggshells and worried about reelection. But if it works for them, it works. Now, the most significant improvement from 2018 to 2022, a lot of people might think it's Florida. It's actually Ohio, where Mike DeWine won by over 25 points in a race where for the Senate was only a 6.5 point race. I want to show you the Senate real quick. So pay attention to DeWine's margin there. Got 62.5% of the vote. Let's go over to the Senate. Here we have JD Vance winning by 6.5 points. And that was largely because, one, JD Vance was a pretty weak candidate, but in fact, Tim Ryan was a very strong candidate, and that mattered a lot. And one big theme that we're getting to in this coverage is that losing candidates who are strong losing candidates matter. Even if they don't win their respective race, the down ballot effect that their coattails have on local races, congressional races, makes a huge, huge difference. And I want to show you why that is in the House. Look at Ohio here. The 1st congressional district was a Democratic pickup. The 9th congressional district, which was actually redrawn and gerrymandered to make it more competitive to get Captor out, she won that by double digits. Tim Ryan's old seat, which we thought would be a likely Republican pickup, they held on to that. Democrats held on to that. And that largely had to do with Tim Ryan's strength. Go over to Pennsylvania. We thought Republicans would flip Susan Wild's seat, the 7th. She held on, barely, but held on. The 8th seat, Matt Cartwright held on. He was expected to lose by a lot of pundits. Connor Lamb's old seat over here in the 17th, Democrats held that. And that had to do with one, Josh Shapiro, and to a lesser extent, John Fetterman's strength. There were 3 seats that Republicans could have easily picked up here that they didn't because of that. So the theme that down ballot races are highly affected by strong losing candidates matters. Similarly, on the flip side of that, look at New York. Remember New York, how that was about a mid-single digit race, 5.5 points. Well, look at this. Republicans flipped the 4th district, the 3rd district, the 17th district, and the 19th district. Democrats narrowly held on in the 18th. They almost flipped 5 seats. They flipped a solid 4. And why that matters is the House was so close going into this election, where Democrats had 220 seats, Republicans had 213. Basically, Republicans had to net 3 seats. And, by netting, of course, it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing. So if you win 2 and lose 1, you net 1. Everyone knows how that works. But all things held equal, they could have won the House strictly off of New York. They also could have won the House strictly off of Florida, where this was due to gerrymandering. They picked up the 13th district, which was gerrymandered. You see on the east side of Pinellas County, where it's blue, part of the 14th district. This part of Pinellas County is very blue, whereas over here out west, it's a lot redder. And so this race was fundamentally shifted in Republicans' favor. And the other 2 that we're looking at, the 7th in Florida, that was a solid seat, as well as the 4th. So those seats, the Florida seats, were more so gerrymandering, and they would have flipped regardless of the outcome there. But New York's was almost exclusively based off of the down ballot effect of Hochul's weakness at the top. Going back to governors, the one that everyone's talking about tonight, the one island where it seemed to be completely protected from a lack of red wave everywhere else, was Florida. And look at the margin here, almost 20 points, 19.5 points. Now that's significant because Florida is traditionally a very competitive state. Everyone remembers in 2000 how Florida came down to 535 votes. I think it was 537 votes in a recount. And in 2018, Florida was decided by 0.4 points. And 2014 was about a point race. So was 2010. Florida is traditionally a very, very competitive state. I had this joke about Florida where it's like if you offered Floridians either ice cream or the chance to be kicked in the face, getting kicked in the face would win 50-49. That's traditionally been the case in Florida. It's a very interesting, used to be an interesting microcosm of the country where it's really about 6 states in one. The north of Florida is like the deep south. The West Coast, the Gulf Coast, is like the Midwest. A lot of retirees from the Midwest go down there. Palm Beach and Broward County is like the Northeast. A lot of folks from New York and New Jersey retire there. And Miami is really its own thing. It's a heavily Latino district. A lot of Cuban Americans vote there. And for the first time since 2002, Miami-Dade County was actually flipped red, which is very significant. But this has pretty extraordinary implications for 2024, because on one hand, it takes Florida off the map of competitive states, and it realigns what states are going to get the most attention in 2024. And it also has implications in the Republican primary, where it might be a little bit more competitive than we thought last week. Going to the House. Now, just like the Senate, which was a very small lift for it to flip, where we expected that to happen pretty easily, the House was an even easier flip. If you looked at 538, Nate Silver's predictions, Republicans had an 84% chance of flipping the House. All the betting markets, all the pundits expected this to be called on election night. But we are here later in the week, still, TBD what's going to happen. And the reason for that is there's a lot of uncalled races out west, specifically in California, to a lesser extent, Arizona, Washington State, Colorado. But best case scenario for Republicans at this point is a very, very thin majority, like 220 to maybe 222 seats. And where we are seeing flips are typically in states where the districts were either redrawn to favor them, or states that experience a significant red wave, like New York. Meaning that if the districts were drawn as they were prior to the last census, they probably wouldn't win the House. And that was extremely unexpected, because as we went through earlier, typically the first midterm of any president's presidency is very bad for them. Trump lost the House, Obama lost the House, Bill Clinton lost the House, Reagan. In fact, you have to go all the way back to 1962, when Kennedy was president, to have a better outcome for a Democratic president in their first term, if all else holds equal and the races that we're looking at look like they're going to go the way they are. Going to Colorado here, it looks like Democrats are going to win Colorado's 8th. That was not expected. And look at the 3rd district. This is coming down to the wire between Lauren Boebert and Frisch. That one is probably not going to be resolved maybe for a week or so, or a couple weeks. I would say, though, given what's outstanding, Boebert's probably favored to win, but she is going to be a top tier target in 2024. So this election out west in the 3rd of Colorado was a lot more competitive than anyone ever expected. California, we have down here in the 49th, Democrats are looking to hold that. They're looking good in the 47th, Katie Porter's district. They have promising opportunity in the 13th, as well as they have quite a bit of opportunity in the 41st as well. You notice that Calvert is still up there, but as votes are coming in, we see only about half of the vote is in so far. That might be more favorable to Rollins, and that looks like it could be a potential flip as well. So keep your eye on that. Another place where Democrats seem to be doing well is up in Washington State in the 3rd district. They're currently holding on to a just under 5,000 vote lead. This is a Republican-held seat. Jamie Herrera Butler held this seat. She lost a primary to Joe Kent after she actually was one of the few Republicans in the House that voted for impeachment after January 6th. And that largely was what cost her primary. But that was the party sort of shooting themselves in the foot, because Kent looks like he's going to lose this race. And that's going to be a Democratic pickup. It'll be a very competitive seat in 24, of course. But that is very similar to actually what happened if we go over to Michigan. Democrats flipped the 3rd district by quite a large margin. And this was a seat that also had a pro-impeachment Republican who lost a primary to a very right-wing Trump-endorsed candidate who ended up getting blown out of the water in this race. So that gets back to, candidate quality in a lot of these elections make for a very, very consequential and determining factor in them. Now, those are the results. What do they mean now, and what do they mean going into 2024? Now, number one, whoever ends up winning the House, I would say, Republicans are probably 2-1 favored to do so at this time. They're going to be governing with a very, very razor-thin majority. And that makes it very difficult to keep a hold of a caucus that has factions in it that are not always friendly to the leadership. Now, I want you to go back to 2015, late 2015. John Boehner at the time was Speaker of the House, and he decided to resign, to step down on his own accord. And that opened up a leadership race for Speaker. And Kevin McCarthy at the time was next in line. And he actually failed to get a majority support for Speaker. He couldn't put together a coalition that would elect him. And that was because of the Freedom Caucus, a right-wing faction within the Republican caucus that objected to him. And this was also at a time when Republicans had a much more comfortable majority in the House. What ended up happening there, of course, is McCarthy's speakership bid was killed, and Paul Ryan ended up being the compromise candidate. And he, of course, ended up becoming Speaker. Now, could you possibly see a repeat of that this year? Well, McCarthy's been very cautious ever since then. I think he's scarred by what happened to him in 2015. So he might find himself in a sort of deja vu where if he doesn't have very many votes to lose, and he's already seen some objections from Republican members of Congress. Congressman Matt Gaetz, for example, objected to McCarthy, and he speaks for a pretty extreme far-right faction of the caucus, so he might be able to take some votes along with him. And what could possibly end up happening is McCarthy gets a challenge for the speakership. I think likeliest would be Congressman Jim Banks, would probably be a likely candidate to do that. And I don't think Banks could get a majority either, far from it. But what I think could happen from that is it would become apparent that McCarthy cannot command a majority, and they end up going with a compromise candidate again. Who's the likeliest for that? Well, similar to how Paul Ryan was 7 years ago, Steve Scalise is the one to watch for that. Now, Scalise is not going to challenge McCarthy directly. He's already made that clear. He's running for majority leader, which is the launching pad to eventually being Speaker. That's sort of next in line, if you will. And I think what might happen is McCarthy fails to get enough votes because he might be blamed for Republicans not doing as well as they thought they would. And that ends up with Scalise being the compromise candidate. What are some other possible implications for 2024? Well, going back to Florida, this is going to be interesting in a Republican primary because one, it was largely assumed beforehand that the 2024 Republican nomination would be a coronation for former President Trump. In fact, he has announced that he will make an announcement that he is going to be running for president on the 15th. And prior to last week, it seemed like he would have little to no competition for that. The name that was brought up most before that was DeSantis, but even still, it looked like he would be pretty easily defeated in a primary against Trump. And I think that's still true today. But DeSantis is in a much stronger position than he was a week ago, given how easily he won Florida, how he defied the political gravity elsewhere in the country. And to understand what DeSantis does next, he's at sort of a fork in the road. He has two paths he could take. There's the safe path, the cautious path, or the bold path. And I'll start with the safe path for him. I think he has to ask himself right now if he ever actually does want to be president one day. And if he does, he'd probably go with path number one, the safe path. And that would be staying out of 2024, not running, letting Trump just walk to the nomination and be coronated, and staying 10 miles away from his campaign at all times, not taking the VP slot, not having anything to do with that, and hoping secretly that Trump falls on his face and loses even bigger next time. And hopefully the party would be done with him at that point. And then staying relevant in the party in the meantime over the next 6 years, 4 to 6 years, and making a pitch that he has a lot of elements that Trump's voters like about him, except for, he's more electable, and entering 2028 as a front runner for the nomination. And if he wins that nomination, entering 2028, probably at worst even, if not maybe slightly favored after 2 terms of a Democratic president. Because it's very rare for one party to get more than 2 terms. You had, the last time that happened was in the 1980s when you had 2 terms of Reagan and 1 term of Bush Sr. Almost happened in 2016. You had 2 terms of Obama, and Hillary Clinton almost won. But the tide tends to turn against the party in power, and there tends to be a pendulum swing if you look at history. So that would be the safe route. The more bold route would be realizing the fact that right now his political capital and clout has never been higher than it is, that donors are looking to him as an alternative, and they're lining up more now than they were last week, that the media is a lot more favorable to him now, and that he can make a compelling case to voters as an alternative. But the path to that nomination goes through Trump, and that is going to be a very brutal primary that it's hard to see him coming out unscathed from that. It'll go either one of 2 ways. It'll either be he challenges Trump and loses, and Trump just demolishes him and his career is over from there. If you want to see what that looks like, just look at the Senate race in Florida. Marco Rubio won by a almost identical margin to DeSantis, a complete blowout there. But nobody really is talking about Rubio running for president. And donors aren't lining up behind Rubio 2024. He's now a rank and file member of the Senate, and his national ambitions are all but quashed because he went against Trump in 2016 and lost his home state by 20 points and has never really recovered politically since then. So that's a very big risk for DeSantis if he chooses that route and loses. That could be the end of him there. The other thing, which is less likely, but more possible today than it was last week, is he somehow takes on Trump and wins. In that case, I don't think there is any plausible scenario where Trump accepts defeat, puts his ego aside for the betterment of the party, and has a kumbaya moment where he supports DeSantis in a way that Hillary Clinton supported Obama in 2008, or Bernie Sanders supported Hillary in 2016, or the 20 or so odd candidates that ran in 2020 supported Biden. He's not going to let that go easy. And that might irreparably harm him going into a general election that makes it almost to the point where he's not viable to win a general election. And if he loses that, his career is also done, effectively. So those are the two options, the two forks in the road that he has. The other one is under the scenario where Trump is either unable or unwilling to run, and there is not a shred of evidence that suggests that that's the case. There's obviously the investigation into the documents case where there's a possibility that Trump might be indicted over that, but that seems like sort of a long shot. And even if he was, it's not apparent that that would hurt him politically whatsoever. In fact, I would point to, if you want to see what it looks like when a political figure with a lot of strong popularity, with a base that almost has a cult of personality and is leader of a party that is very competitive, what it looks like when they run for office while under indictment, look to Israel, look to Benjamin Netanyahu. Baby Netanyahu won a majority in the Knesset while under indictment for corruption charges. He was narrowly voted out for a little bit, but then he just came back the other week. And it doesn't seem like his legal woes are a hindrance to him whatsoever. So that's, I think, what you would look like. Also, you can even look at Brazil, where you just had an election where Lula da Silva beat Bolsonaro narrowly. And Lula actually was incarcerated for a while for corruption charges, and he was released and his case was thrown out. But he came back after that and rehabilitated his career, and it didn't seem to affect his support in any real consequential way. So the idea that Trump would, one, forego running for a second term because he's not interested is just, there's zero evidence to suggest that. The notion that he would be deterred by legal woes, in fact, I think legal challenges to him would almost make it more likely that he runs or that he's more intent on running and winning, because he sees the presidency as sort of a bubble where he can't be touched by the legal system, because there's a DOJ precedent where you cannot indict a sitting president. That's not in the Constitution. That's just simply sort of like an explanatory memo and standard practice that the DOJ has gone by. There's no need to honor that. And in fact, I think there's a good argument not to, but that's a big reason why he was inoculated from that during his first term. So what DeSantis does is going to be interesting, but to understand where his thinking might be, you have to understand the career trajectory he's had. And that has always been being an underdog, defying expectations, and almost miraculously coming out on top. And that goes back to 2012 when he won a congressional primary and an upset against an establishment candidate. It goes back to 2018, when he was clearly the underdog in not only the primary, but the general election in Florida. In fact, in the primary, agricultural commissioner Adam Putnam was the heavy favorite to win. He had all the establishment backing. He had all the donors lined up behind him. And DeSantis never competed with him on that same playing field. Instead, what he would do is he would go onto Fox News, onto programs like Hannity that he knew Trump watched, and would just vigorously defend him, be a complete, for better lack of a better term, lackey for Trump, and just lavish him with praise. And that resulted in Trump endorsing him. He ended up winning the primary by a 20-point landslide. And then he went into 2018 as the underdog, not leading in almost any polls. I think you could maybe count on one hand the number of polls that he was even remotely close to being tied to or leading in that race. He, on the first day, I'll never forget, on the first day of the general election, he stumbled out with a pretty bad gaffe that kind of sent his campaign into a tailspin. He didn't seem to really recover. He didn't do well in the debates. He struggled organizationally. He had to bring in one of Trump's top strategists to manage his campaign in the final stretch of things, and very few people thought he would win. And he ended up pulling off a very slim upset in that race in 2018. And then look at how he governed as well, too. He took some very bold, almost reckless risks. He took on things that are considered third rail in Florida politics. He had a major public fight with Carnival Cruises, the cruise industry, which employs tens of thousands of people in the state of Florida. And that was over the vaccine mandates. That was seen as a politically very reckless, dangerous move, because if the cruise lines relocated, that would have cost tens of thousands of jobs. He took on Disney over some culture war issues that seemed to not make a whole lot of sense politically, that seemed like it could backfire spectacularly. He made some moves on COVID that seemed pretty risky at the time as well. In fact, he was the only governor at the onset of COVID that saw his approval ratings drop when everyone else saw theirs improve. And that had largely to do with the challenges in the unemployment insurance system at first. But over time, it paid off for him, some of these moves, becoming at least the media face of anti-lockdown measures. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that he actually did that. In fact, he issued a stay-at-home order. He was not ahead of the curve policy-wise among many of the governors there. And Brian Kemp opened up earlier than he did, but he's a lot more media savvy than all those other governors, so he got credit for that. And in politics, it's not necessarily about what you do, it's about what you get credit for. So he's really built up his brand that way, and went from a very thin margin win in 2018 to an utter landslide in 2020. So if he's looking at 2024, he's probably thinking, he could do the safe route, or he could go bold, be the underdog, and try to defy expectations again and see if luck is still on his side. And his career trajectory since up until this point probably lends him to believe that he should go big. On the other hand, looking at the safe route, Chris Christie took that route when it came to 2012. A lot of people wanted him to run. He won in an upset in New Jersey, a much, much bluer state, in 2009. He was seen as a top-tier recruit for 2012. A lot of Republican primary voters were unsatisfied with the options they had in the primary in 2012. There was a flavor of the month candidate that would lead in the polls, seems like every few weeks, until they eventually settled on Mitt Romney. And Chris Christie declined to run. He wanted to win re-election in a landslide in 2013, which of course he did. He won by an even bigger margin than DeSantis did in Florida. And he thought going into 2016, he would be a juggernaut and unstoppable for the nomination. But he learned a lesson the hard way, and that is the political lifespan of being relevant and viable is a very short window, has a very short shelf life. And when it's your time, when you're at the top, if you don't seize that opportunity, it might pass you by and you'll never get it. Think about, Barack Obama in 2008, where he, defied the odds in taking on Hillary Clinton, and that ended up paying out very well for him. If he didn't do that at that point, it's unclear if he would ever become president. Maybe, that might have been his time. That was his time, and he took it. Chris Christie didn't jump at his time. He thought that he would probably lose, the 2012 election in a general, and he probably would have, almost certainly would have. But that was his time to win the nomination, at least. And I think DeSantis looks at this and thinks, well, one, he might not want to kamikaze his career in taking on Trump, but two, he also doesn't want to be the next Chris Christie or the next Scott Walker. And that's going to play a heavy hand in his calculus here. What does this mean, this map and everything mean for 2024? Well, let's look at the states that are in play. Now, Florida, that's kind of off the map. That's going to be red. These states, there are some here that are swing states, like North Carolina was pretty close. And New Hampshire obviously is a swing state, but given the history of them, I'm just going to put them in those columns. And we are going to be looking at the same states in 2024. We're going to be looking at Georgia. We're going to be looking at Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Now, Democrat strength in Pennsylvania, why is that important? Well, look at this. They start out, Republicans start out maybe with a 235 electoral vote floor, Democrats at 225. Remember, the magic number is 270. So if you get Pennsylvania off the map there, that puts them at 244. You get Michigan off the map, 259. Now, all of a sudden, the map looks a lot better for them, and it's a lot more narrow of a playing field. True, they are going to have to spend a lot of time and resources and money in those states to hold the blue wall, so to speak. But their results there are very, very promising going in for 2 years from now. Now, what does that mean? If say they flip Arizona and they lose every other state, they still win the presidency. Say they lose Arizona, but they flip Georgia, still win the presidency. Say they lose, win Nebraska's second congressional district, which Biden did, but they flip Wisconsin, they still win the presidency. This expands their map significantly. And that is going to play out very consequentially in 2024. Now, you can't really prognose a presidential election cycle off of how a midterm goes, because obviously, Ronald Reagan had a terrible midterm in 1982. He won by a 49 state landslide in 1984. Bill Clinton had a terrible midterm in 1994. He won by a landslide in 1996. Obama had a terrible midterm in 2010, won by a landslide in 2012. Trump had a bad midterm in 2018, lost in 2020. So it's not predictive because, as I said before, politics, a short time in politics is an eternity. Like 2 years in politics is an eternity. There could be a number of things that happen between now and then that completely shift the dynamics of the race there. But all in all, looking at this, President Biden has to feel pretty good about going into 2024, because this likely means that if he wants the nomination, it's his. He's probably not going to get serious opposition in a primary from now. And that might have been true if, say, the midterm went pretty badly for Democrats. And Trump, is probably going to get more competition than he otherwise would have now. And that matters too. And looking at the state races, there are a number of secretaries of state and governors that were running in some of these crucial swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona's TBD, that were engaged in election denialism, that might have done what they could have with their power to tip the scales for Trump. And if it came down to appointing fake electors or suppressing the vote in some way or restricting it, they would have done their due diligence and done what they could to tip it in his favor. And now that is off the table. So it makes a constitutional crisis in 2024 a lot less likely. And that ultimately, regardless of how that election goes, is a comforting thing for the health of democracy and for the sake of the country. But now that we are, out of the woods for 2022, still have some things left to be called. That'll come in the following days and weeks. 2024 is going to start ramping up now. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that develops. But keep paying attention to that. Remember what we were talking about with the strength of candidates and why challenging every race matters. Even in non-competitive elections, I firmly believe that no incumbent should go unchallenged by a competitor. And the reason for that is, one, even if it's not a competitive district or state, an opposition candidate, right or left, still speaks for a significant number of people in that district or state. And if you are a congressman or a governor or a senator, you represent everybody in your respective district or state, not just the ones that voted for you. And it's important for those people that don't vote for you to be heard too. Another reason is there are down ballot effects. In states like Texas, Beto O'Rourke, or in Ohio with Tim Ryan, while they might not have won their races, their organization and the down ballot effect that had on the local races saved, and even in some cases flipped, congressional seats that otherwise wouldn't have. And that matters too. And thirdly, and most importantly, is you never know when you're going to win. Think back to 2017 when there was a special election in Alabama. Now, look at Alabama, solidly red state, 2-1 Republican. But in Alabama, when Jeff Sessions became attorney general and there was an open special election there, the Republican candidate was Judge Roy Moore, who had some very serious, disturbing controversies and allegations against him that gave even a lot of Republican voters pause on whether they think that this man should be in the United States Senate, much less, within 500 feet of a school. And he ended up losing to Doug Jones, who probably, when he started his race, never in a million years thought that he would win, but he ran as sort of a sacrificial lamb, and he actually ended up becoming a senator for 2 years. And that made a very consequential difference in the country and in policy and in what happened in Congress. So never cede ground on any race. Every election should have at least two choices. And that's a big takeaway from this as well. But anyways, thank you for joining me on this. I'll have updates in the future. We'll have future sessions on this. And if you voted in the 2022 midterms, thank you for that. If you volunteered or donated or took some active role in a campaign, thank you for that as well. I've always been a big believer in the more people have a say in what our government does, the better it functions and the more responsive it is. So democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something that you have to get in the field and you have to play it. So thank you for that. And I will see you all next time. Have a great day.